analyst. Now we move on to our next news. Russia says it prefers a political and diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine, but claims its efforts have been rejected by both Kyiv and Western nations. According to Russian media citing Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, Peskov also claimed that Moscow continues its military operation in Ukraine because all proposals for dialogue were rejected, both by Ukraine and by Western countries. This comes as Russian media reports that Russia claimed on Saturday that its forces had captured 2 more villages in eastern Ukraine, while Ukraine on the same day reported repelling multiple Russian offensives. Meanwhile, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has said that he would like to achieve the settlement for Ukraine and the lasting peace in the Middle East before the end of the term of Donald Trump in the presidential office. Now we're joined by Gilbert Doctorow. He's a Russian affairs expert, joins us live from Brussels. Thank you, Gilbert, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, from your point of view, how credible is Russia's position on speaking as diplomatic solution, and is there any evidence that exists to support or challenge their claims?
Well, the Russians certainly would like a diplomatic solution. They don't want the war to go on endlessly. If they have to conquer all of Ukraine and get to the Polish border, they still would face an insurrection, which could go on forever. So yes, they want a diplomatic solution. They want a diplomatic solution on their terms, which they've stated repeatedly, meaning the demilitarization of Ukraine, its neutrality status, the absence of any foreign troops or installations. Well, these terms are well known. The fact is that both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, are each pressing for a conclusion of talks that amounts to the capitulation of the other side. They are very far apart, and for that reason, each is making a claim, as Russia is doing with Mr. Peskov, that the other side is not negotiating in good faith and does not intend to find a diplomatic solution. The Russians right now are making military gains. Most importantly, they are some of their troops have entered the strategic hub, the logistics center of Pokrovsk, which is known in Russian as Krasnoyarsk. That is of decisive importance for their eventual full control of the Donbass. However, it's not an end to the war, and therefore they indeed are saying that they want a diplomatic solution.
And now, how does the involvement of external mediators like the US, Turkey, complicate or potentially accelerate the peace process?
I'm glad you mentioned Turkey as an external player here, because now they are portrayed as the broker, as the hosts to the negotiations in Istanbul, and that would sound as if they're neutral. Well, they certainly are not neutral. Turkey has very important economic ties to Russia, but it also has, let's call them ideological or historical interests in parts of Ukraine, in particular in Crimea. And the relationship between Erdogan and the head of the Ukrainian negotiating team, Mr. Umerov, has to be brought out. Umerov is a Crimean Tatar, and it is not accidentally that the Ukrainian negotiating team on its way to Istanbul stopped in Ankara to speak to Erdogan. But the intervention of Western powers is maybe something that we don't see, but should see. I have in mind the ongoing disturbances in Kyiv and around the country, where more than 10,000 people came out and demonstrated over the issue of a new law that strips of its independence the 2 agencies involved in fighting corruption. That these demonstrations took place is only possible if we understand the intervention of a major external power. And I would suggest that power is the United States. How it is that there were no such demonstrations for the last 3 years, because if you demonstrated, you get your skull cracked if you were lucky, or you'd be killed if you were less lucky. There were no demonstrations. And suddenly, in the last 10 days, there have been repeated demonstrations of very important size and I'd say belligerency towards the Zelensky regime. So I think that the United States, or another power, but most likely the United States, is behind the scenes preparing for the exit of Mr. Zelensky.
And now, what does this military tug-of-war signal about the current balance of power on the ground, with Russia claiming its advances and Ukraine claiming its defenses?
Well, it's hard for an outsider to make much sense of these military claims by each side. In point of fact, the Russians have advanced, made very big advances in June, the biggest advances in conquering territory in the Donbass since the start of the war. But let's put it in perspective. The 550 square kilometers that the Russians took in June is approximately the same size as the part of Kursk Oblast in the Russian Federation, which the Ukrainians seized in August of 2024 and occupied until January of 2025. So these gains are still in territory by the Russians, are still relatively small. What has been big has been the kill ratio. The Russians have vastly outperformed the Ukrainian armies in neutralizing troops on the other side. By that I mean killing and maiming soldiers to the point where they withdraw from the fight. So in this sense, the Russian war is a war of attrition against the soldiery of the other side, not a war of capturing territory.
Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insight as Russian affairs expert. That was